My name is Joe White. I'm Professor of Political Science and Public Policy and Director of the Center for Policy Studies here at Case Western Reserve University. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this Global Currents discussion, which is made possible by the generosity of Ms. Eloise Briskin. The idea of the Global Currents discussions is to bring in somebody to talk about an issue, get sort of behind the headlines, beyond what you're usually picking up from the news. And I try to find topics that strike me as looking at things in ways that you're not necessarily seeing quite the same way most of the time. And so watching the Gilets jaunes events in France, the question that occurred to me was essentially how much of this is French and how much of this is just sort of in general what's going on in the Western world today. It's easy to draw parallels, for example, to Brexit or to our current president and to general trends within the West, so-called. But also, once you ask the question of how much of it is French, you really have to start digging into what on earth is going on there. So I thought that it would be really nice to have somebody to talk about how French are France's problems at the moment. And I thought quickly of my friend Patrick Chamorel, who is, as you will see and hear, quite French. But has
what do you mean by that?
meaning he is handsome and debonair and
no, I took it as a compliment.
and knows a great deal about wine and
I certainly drink it. Yeah.
Yes, but also actually did his doctoral work on American politics. Came to the United States in the 1990s. Ended up settling in Washington, where he's a guest scholar, resident scholar rather, at Stanford's Washington program, but has done a whole lot of sort of interesting things with U.S. politics, French politics, transatlantic relations, having fellowships at places like the Wilson Center. He was actually a congressional fellow. Working on the Hill in the early 1990s, so has a sort of
as a spy.
As a spy, yes. has a view of understands American politics hopefully well enough to explain French politics to Americans. That's what I'm really hoping for. So it is my great pleasure to welcome Patrick Chamorel and let him do the talking.
Thank you very much, Joe. It's a pleasure to be back to Cleveland and to Case Western, where I was invited by Joe 15 years ago. I must say that he has a great sense of timing. Like 15 years ago, we were in the midst of the Iraq crisis. So one very serious transatlantic crisis. And this time, again, we are in the midst of another transatlantic crisis because of Trump.
Can you turn up the mic a little more?
Well, that I'm not in control. Yeah, thank you. And Joe's timing is also very good. He's invited me in the winter again. But this time, at least, we have beautiful sunshine and mild temperature. It must be global warming, of course. Anyway, today I'm going to talk, as Joe told you, about the latest of the French political crises. There are many, that unfold simultaneously, but this is the most serious in terms of the level of violence and potentially political consequences since the May 1968 student revolts. So I will, well, first of all, the name Yellow Vest comes from these jackets that people have to have in their cars. It's mandatory, to be, if you get out of your car at night especially, you can be seen in the headlight of other cars. So that's just a precision at the outset. So you've all seen, these pictures of violence in Paris and other large cities. And so today I'd like to, explore who these Gilets jaunes, who they are, what they stand for, and try to change in French politics, and to put them back into the context of recent French political history, as well as the context of other populist movements, because this is, an expression, as we will see, of populism, the Gilets jaunes, throughout Europe. And so this is what I'm going to try to do. So of course Europe has been struck by a series of political crises, economic crises too, in the last decade or so, and we probably all know which they are. I will just mention the euro crisis in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008, that Greece being the poster country for that crisis, the Syrian refugee crisis, which had most of its impact on Germany, on Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, a wave of terrorist attacks, especially in France, 3 major ones, but not only in France, and Brexit, of course, which is still in the state of suspense, and Catalonia, who was trying to become independent, and of course, the immigration, issues about immigration and Islam, which has become really central in European politics, and with a backlash against immigration and Islam. So, as a result of these crises, in most European countries, the vast majority, at least one populist movement has been on the rise. Sometimes two. They are either, most of them, on the right wing of the political spectrum, but some are on the left, and they do exist in, rich and homogeneous countries like Scandinavia, Switzerland, Austria, etc., just as they also exist in larger, more heterogeneous countries. And in some countries, they are actually, in the governing coalition. Like in Italy, they have all the power, the 2 populist parties. In Austria is the case too, in Poland, in Hungary, and in some Scandinavian countries. So, in that dire, European landscape, where does France fit? Well, I think France would be given a below-average grade because of slower economic growth than in its neighboring, in its neighbors' economies, like Germany, Eastern Europe, and the UK. Higher persistent unemployment, above 9%, when many other countries are around 4%. Still high budget deficits and debt, just above 3%, which the European Union mandates to go below. And it had, of course, again, these major terrorist attacks, and has a major issue of crisis of identity, if you want, with its Muslim minority. So those issues, led also to, in France, like everywhere else, a rise of the far right, and with the Front National reaching the runoff of the presidential elections in 2002, and of course recently, last year as well, with a drop in trust in political institutions, with the last 2 presidents were not re-elected. The abstention in major elections is also going up. So lots of symptoms of a country that is not doing very well. So the Front National is really the oldest of these, populist party, because it started in the mid-80s, and it's been one of the most powerful in Europe. And of course, Marine Le Pen made the runoff of the latest presidential elections. So why, with all of these problems, did Emmanuel Macron win the last presidential elections? Because people thought that after Brexit and Trump, France was next. Well, I'm not going to get into that too precisely, but of course there is only a minority of people still who support the Front National. And in the runoff elections, you need to have allies. And Marine Le Pen did not have any ally. And so Macron could win in after the collapse of the traditional center-right and center-left parties and the rise of extremist parties, which together, far left and far right, reach about 40% of the vote. So Macron took part of the center-right, part of the center-left, and built up a majority to win. So Macron became the defender of liberal democracy, having won very strikingly against Marine Le Pen by 66% of the vote against 33. And so was kind of, as you know, like an international hero of sorts. And he had started to enact his policies in a fairly successful manner. He was trying to, first of all, liberalize the French economy, which he's done to some extent, weakening in the process the labor unions, especially with the railway strikes, and making labor laws more flexible, etc. His second goal was to protect workers and industries from the wind of international competition, but not at the national level, at the European level. There he didn't succeed as well because of Merkel being too fragile to come to help him, because of Northern Europe, which is very free trade, and Eastern Europe, which is trying to export its workers to the West, and you don't want to lose that opportunity. And thirdly, Macron wanted to kind of reunite the French, especially to try to start solving this identity crisis. And on that, he's really not done much of anything because it's a very explosive set of issues, and he stayed away from it. So Macron was doing very well, with approval ratings around 40%, which doesn't sound like that great, but for France, it's pretty good. And until things kind of tanked, and it started, and for three reasons. It started in last July, with an obscure scandal involving one of his top security officers, and it turned out that security officers had went into a fight with some demonstrators on the French Labor Day on May 1st, and that Macron might have covered that up. So it seems like to be not that important, but it had a huge impact in public opinion because Macron, presented himself as a more ethical president, and having heralded a new era in French politics, and people realized that he was still practicing favoritism, the old-fashioned way. And so his image, if you want, he was calling himself Jupiter, kind of collapsed. And within a couple of weeks, he lost about 10% in approval ratings. The second reason was a succession of very provocative political statements, public statements, like telling someone who is unemployed, well, you just have to cross the street to find a job, or to say, well, you're nothing unless you succeed in this digital economy. So this really hurt. He wants to make France, like what he says, a startup nation, but it doesn't work for everyone. And many people saw that as very contemptful about and arrogant on the part of Macron. So the suspicion grew that Macron didn't really understand France in its depth, and it's true that he's never been elected, even on a local level, that he comes from a bourgeoisie. His parents were both doctors, but he came also from a fairly impoverished town in northern France, which industries have disappeared, etc. So, but he left that place to study in Paris and went to the very best schools, and had a stint as an investment banker at Rothschild Bank. So he became like the president of the rich in many people's minds, and only 11% of people thought that he is close to their concerns, so very low. The third factor was that a few specific policies were starting to be implemented, and that came to a head. And these policies are, first of all, the speed limit on most highways was 90 kilometers per hour, about 60 miles per hour, came down to 80 kilometers per hour. Seems not very serious politically, but it was very unpopular. And the second thing was also related to driving. It was a tax, a carbon tax on diesel fuel. That made, of course, the price at the pump much higher. And in France, diesel cars are about 60% of all cars. Yeah, it's true actually in Germany too and everywhere else. So these two measures, speed limit and the carbon tax, impacted people who have to drive a lot the most, disproportionately, and that is the people, modest people, who are living in the periphery of large cities or in rural areas and have to commute every day. And so people thought that it was very unfair to have them, the most modest of French people, bear the cost of these policies. And so this is when social media comes in. Some people, sent messages, videos, etc., that became viral, against Macron's policies, against Macron himself, and that, they took again this name, the Gilets jaunes. There was no leader. They didn't want to institutionalize that movement, but they had two strategies. First of all, to occupy the roundabouts, which are usually on the outskirts of big cities. There are many of them. Actually, France has like 60% of all the roundabouts in Europe. I could explain why, but and these people, also started destroying radars on the roadsides, as well as tolls on the freeways. The second thing was to organize demonstrations in the heart of big cities, where actually, rich people live. And the people who they thought, don't have to pay for, environmental policies because they don't have to commute very far and there is public transportation anyway. So this is how that movement started. And it became, of course, as you've seen, more and more violent, not only because of the yellow vests themselves, but because of other groups that were hidden behind the Gilets jaunes, to wreck things. like you saw in the Arch of Triumph and stores, etc. So those are the far left groups, the far right ones, and then the looters, who come from, youngsters coming from just outside of the cities. But of course, it damaged the image of the Gilets jaunes. But the Gilets jaunes themselves, are patriotic folks. They are very reluctant to exert violence and to damage places like the Arch of Triumph. So the movement, yes, became more and more radicalized to the point that today, there is rhetoric, very extremist rhetoric that includes anti-Semitism and racism. So what do these people want? And who are they, really? It seems that there are three major grievances. One is purely economic. It has to do with the tax that they don't want, and they were repelled. And it has to do with, like social justice. It's interesting in France, which is a very egalitarian society, where the Gini coefficient, which measures the difference between the richest and the poorest, is very, very low. It's about 3 to 1. So the richest, only make 3 times more after redistribution. And redistribution in France, through taxes and through public policies, is very high because the welfare state is very generous. So it takes, the Gini coefficient from about 5 to 3. And it's interesting that, people feel so much, social and economic injustice in a country which is so egalitarian. But as, Alexis de Tocqueville said, the more you suppress inequalities, the more those that remain are unbearable, right? So in those economic grievances, you have people who focus more on lowering taxes. Usually they are independent people, small businesses, etc. And then those who want more public services and who come more from the left. The second set of messages is about anti-elitism. They revolt against the rich, people who have power. It's very anti-elitist. And of course, Macron himself is right there because he's the picture of elitism because of his background and etc. And so the third thing, and they ask for Macron's resignation. If you look at most of the slogans, they really ask for Macron's resignation. The third set of issues have to do with democracy, and political representation. Give us a voice. And their key request here is, ballot initiatives, citizen-driven ballot initiatives. What they say basically is that, the elites are not on our side. This doesn't work for us. We need to change the system. So they are against, the elites in general, and the media, of course, because they think that the media, portrays them as racist and fascist and basic people, etc. And they have this kind of wounded pride, that led them to say, no, we are not like this at all. So 70% of the French actually thinks that democracy doesn't work properly. 71% that politicians are corrupt. I guess you'd find that in many countries. 68% that they don't trust neither the right nor the left to govern the country. So now, who are they really? They are mostly defined by their economic status, by their educational level, and I'm going to show you the first slide. No, the first slide is here. And more so than by their professions or their political affiliations. So, for example, you see that if the more, the more you go up the socio-economic ladder, the less support the Gilets jaunes have. These are those people who really identify as Gilets jaunes. So they're only 16% total, but you see that the upper class is below 16%, and independents like small businesses, employees, factory workers, way above. Okay? Second, and you see that what's so interesting is that in the Gilets jaunes movement, you have independents, small businessmen, and factory workers who never were together in other struggles, political struggles, and on strikes, etc. Because these guys are usually considered to voting on the right and workers on the left, but not so much anymore. They are together, finding, a common ground. Then they are defined also geographically. As I said, they are on the periphery of big cities, and I will add to that in a moment. And thirdly, educational level is very important. That's my next slide. See? So again, the more you studied, the less likely you are to support the Gilets jaunes. And so you have a much higher support from people who have not finished high school, for example. And that explains that, like, people who have about the same income as, independents or many, farmers, etc., like teachers, they don't side with the Gilets jaunes. Like teachers are only 8% to support the Gilets jaunes. So the Gilets jaunes is mostly private sector people, less educated, and on the periphery of large cities. What they are not, what you don't see among the Gilets jaunes, is, so it's the most educated people, including teachers who don't make very much, rich people, big cities, center cities, where the richest, of course, live, especially Paris. Very few people are from Paris, so all the pictures you see is people from the provinces or from the ex-burbs, if you want, who are flocking to central Paris every Saturday. And no, or very few immigrants. So the banlieue, who are around the big cities, they don't share in this fight with Gilets jaunes. So next is, so yes, the point here, I'm giving you also the sociology of the vote for Brexit and Trump. And you see that, and this is the educational levels, and you see it's exactly the same thing. Okay? So the more educated, the less you're going to vote for Brexit or Trump, and the less you're going to join the Gilets jaunes. So now, political affiliation. So you see that it goes from the left, which is the far left here, yeah. Then the traditionally largest party of the left, the Socialist Party, LREM, which is La République en Marche, Macron, LR, center-right, and Front National, which has a new name now, it's called Rassemblement National. So what do you see? Of course, because it's such an anti-Macron movement, so people from LREM try to defend him, and so they don't join the movement that much. But otherwise, it is the extremes, the RN and the far left, which are the most mobilized within the Gilets jaunes. And the left, more so than the center left than the center right. Again, you have now, populations in France which don't live in the same areas anymore. So it's more and more segmented. And if I would draw like concentric circles, you would see in the middle the center cities, wealthy, those, no gilets jaunes. Then around the banlieue, mostly immigrants, no gilets jaunes. Then the next one is the ex-burbs, and the next one, the rural areas, and this is where the gilets jaunes are. So that still doesn't explain, why within a span of 14 months, the political atmosphere in France has drastically changed. I pointed to the triggers, but why fundamentally have we seen that? Well, first of all, I think that the Macron victory in 2007 was kind of overinterpreted, as an adhesion to the traditional democratic values, and that in that election, again, the mainstream parties collapsed. Macron picked up the pieces, but there was still 40% of the voters who voted for either the far right or the far left, which is an absolute record. So it was an anti-establishment election. Really? Macron anti-establishment? He is from the best school, he's been a top civil servant, worked for Rothschild banks, etc. He is the epitome of the establishment. So what it was, that election, is not an outsider who, would completely swipe out the political landscape, but it's just, one set of elites replacing the same elites, which is the top, civil service, coming from a school like ENA, etc. In fact, Macron's election was revealed that, his sociological basis was very narrow. It was mostly, people from the central cities, well-off people, no minorities, or very few, and so that was a very small segment of the population. Actually, his score in the first round was 24%. And the second round, of course, it was mostly a vote against Marine Le Pen rather than for Macron. So a very narrow sociological base and a very narrow policy base, because all of the policies he argued for, which is economic liberalization, more European integration, no reduction of immigration, and not much discussion about Islam. This is not what people want. So it's a very small minority, about 24% precisely, that support the policies that Macron started to implement. So Macron's victory was obtained, through some kind of elite populism, if you want. But so it's the elite of center right and center left which help, elect him. But fundamentally, he kind of rejected, the far right, the far left, and the policies that these people would support. So of course, economic liberalization is very needed in France. It's overdue, but the problem for Macron is that it arrived too late. When people have other things on their mind, they want more protection from globalization, from European integration. They want, borders to stop like unfair trade practices, illegal immigrants. So they are no longer in into the policies that Macron has been supporting. So what is striking is that the Gilets jaunes is very much the mirror image of Macron's party. They were both, they came out of the blue. LREM, République en Marche, Macron's party, was also started with the social media. They were against the establishment. They were against intermediary association, etc. And so the same is true for the Gilets jaunes. This kind of, each of them has gone through like a Schumpeterian, process of creative destruction. And so that means that because they are so much alike, one led to the other. Because if you have a government which is based on the elites, you're more likely to have an opposition based on people at the bottom. So I think that instead of being the shield, which we believed, against populism, Macron is actually the enabler of populism, right? So what these two phenomena, the election of Macron and the Gilets jaunes uprising, reflect is kind of we are moving away from right versus left being the central cleavage of French politics. It is not new because it has been visible since at least 2005. I don't know if you remember, but there was a referendum to ratify the European Constitution in 2005, and the French narrowly said no. But if you look, for the first time, it was very obvious that the yes vote was, the well-off, well-educated, etc., and that the no was the other folks. So each party, became kind of divided. The mainstream parties, very divided between the pro-Europe and the anti-Europe, but the social cleavages became more apparent than right versus left. And there is another reason, which is that by now, all of these great ideologies like Catholicism, communism, socialism, Gaullism in France, all of this has collapsed. And these were blending, people from all social strata. And now it's completely gone. So all you have now is only, okay. All you have now is elites versus people. So now the question is, is it a unique phenomenon in French history, at least recent history? And of course, if you look at, and there are many social and political uprisings in French politics, in French history. But I'm setting aside, the major revolutions, of course, the French Revolution, and those of, 1830, 48, 70, the Commune, etc., because they really completely changed the political landscape, which the Gilets jaunes haven't done yet. But tax revolts. You had many tax revolts before the French Revolution, and you had, the most recent was Poujadisme, of the name of Monsieur Poujade, was a merchant in the Dordogne region who was against taxes for small businesses and against the development of supermarkets. But it was a very narrowly defined movement around safeguarding a specific profession. So it was not as broad as the Gilets jaunes. Now, is it like a nationalist movement, like the Boulangisme in the late 19th century? That General Boulanger, who was fueled by French revenge against Prussia, which had beaten the French in 1870, or the leagues of the 1930s? No, because Gilets jaunes is mostly economic, so there is not this nationalist element to it, at least not visible. 1968, I was mentioning it. It was a youth movement. It was about utopia, about change. These guys are not about that. It's a very pedestrian set of grievances. And which means that, this movement is more kind of counter-revolutionary than revolutionary. It is to some extent opposed to progressivism, economic liberalization, as well as cultural liberalization, meaning immigration, gay rights, etc., etc. So you have this matrix here, which shows the Macron is on economic liberalization is open, and on cultural liberalization is open. You see that Marine Le Pen is exactly the opposite, closed and closed. And you see that the far left is open on immigration and cultural progressivism, but closed on the economic liberalization. And Fillon, which is center right, is for economic liberalization, but against cultural liberalization. So, but I will come back to this in a second. So of course it's also very different from the banlieue uprising of 2005, because these banlieues really didn't budge at all during this Gilets jaunes episode. And it's also very different from the big, like labor-based revolts, that happened, for example, in 1995 or in 2010, for example. So this one, I think, is in the making. It's very eclectic. It doesn't have a clear direction, no leader, no institutionalization yet. And but it's still a very French kind of movement, if you want, in the sense that it has, like the mythology of revolution to it. That it has the violence. Political violence is more tolerated probably in French political culture than elsewhere. It has the breakdown of social dialogue, between, political leaders and the unions, for example. That has never worked very well. And it has this kind of resentment against the rich, this egalitarian aspect of French culture. Now, how does it compare with other populist movements across Europe and the United States? Well, I looked at most of them. I'm going to speed up here, but I don't see that it's like any of the other ones, which mostly, institutionalize themselves as political parties much quicker, or which are much more narrow or not on the same kind of issues. Like in Germany, like AfD, for example, Alternative for Germany, immediately became a political party. And the Pegida, which is this anti-Islam movement, is nothing to do with, not much to do with the Gilets jaunes. The Italian parties, also, they had a leader from the very beginning. Lega is an old fascist party reconverted. And Five Star always has a leader, an agenda, an organization, which is not the case for the Gilets jaunes. So what might happen now? See, I'm closing in. What might happen now? So first of all, we've seen the radicalization of the movement. It's still very supported above like 50% in the general population, but a little less and less because of the violence. And how has Macron responded to the movement? Well, in three ways. First of all, he has kind of reverted some of his policies, his cherished policies, by announcing that 11 billion euros more than than was in the budget would be spent. But that did, the Gilets jaunes didn't think it was enough at all. The second thing is that he tried to discredit the Gilets jaunes, to mostly paint them as, like far-right extremists, etc. They were language like, like the crazy mob, or these folks who smoke and drive diesel cars, very contemptful, and this kind of thing. So he tried to do that. Why? Is because he wants to recreate this opposition that was very, very favorable to him in the presidential election in 27, which is Macron against the far right, Marine Le Pen at the time. He wants to recreate that also on the European level at the European elections that are coming in May. And the third way he dealt with it is to launch what he called a grand débat. So you have citizens who can go to their, usually to their city hall and have like town hall meetings with the local elected officials, etc. And so all of the grievances are compiled, and we'll see actually in 2 weeks, the results of that. But the Gilets jaunes are very skeptical about this. First, because they thought that Macron uses that for his campaign for Europe, and also because they don't believe that something concrete is going to come out from it. So this is so the second thing I wanted to say is that probably who is going to benefit from it? First of all, if the Gilets jaunes decide to have a list in the European election, that probably will be very good for Macron, because it will take votes away from the far left and the far right. But the far left and the far right are not in the same position within the Gilets jaunes. And if you think of who can benefit the most from that movement, it has to be Marine Le Pen's party. Why? Is because it's much more the symmetric opposition to Macron, whether the far left is split on Europe, is more pro-immigration, etc., etc. So I think that and this shows in the polls actually. Macron went up a little bit, but the Front National, now the Rassemblement National, is on a roll again. So I think this movement, again, it's part of a general new movement of the populist nature, but it has specific French characteristics. And where it will lead, we don't know, but I think it's going to probably lead to some realignment in French political life. I don't think that France can have this central party, LREM, which is really not, which is a very artificial party, and then everybody else against him, against it. I think they will. So we'll see that in 3 stages. The European election, we'll see if Macron is right that the main opposition is nationalist versus progressist. Second, we'll see it in the, and second, we'll see it, of course, in the next presidential election. So the grand débat, how it's going to end, if you want, the European election to the European Parliament, and then I think nothing will really crystallize until the next presidential election. So I'm going to stop here, Joe, and but thank you for your attention, and I'm happy or curious, to know about your comments or your questions.
Well, thank you very much. And I've been given a lot to think about here, so this has worked out the way I wanted it to. I hope you've heard some things you want to think about. And I've been sitting there thinking, I wonder what Professor Ledford is thinking right now. I've been watching him nodding his head or shaking his head and so on. So when people ask questions, please raise the hands, and then we will bring you a microphone, because this is being recorded for the people who couldn't be here. So we will post it on the Center for Policy Studies website. So we want to be able to record the questions as well as the answers. So Lance, could you please give Professor Ledford the microphone?
Thank you.
Welcome.
Is it on? Can you hear me?
The microphone is for her, not for the
Good.
people here.
Thank you. This was a fascinating talk with a great deal. It informed me a great deal about details that I, as a student of Germany, know nothing about France. But it raised two questions. One is very particular to France, and the other is sort of global around this whole populist phenomenon. I think it's fascinating that Macron is taking the chance on the Grand Débat, because my first thought is the cahiers de doléances. And we all know what happened after that, and it wasn't good for the person who had commissioned the taking of the gathering of those complaints.
I would just like to add, please explain that to the audience after he finishes the question.
So if you would speak to I guess maybe the role that history of the French Revolution plays in the education at the Haute École, why this didn't occur to President Macron himself. But the second question, and this is the one that I've been thinking about a lot, listening to the political rhetoric here, listening to the political rhetoric of the Alternative für Deutschland, and also in the Brexit debate, is the very flexible construction of who is the elite that this populism is against. Now, Macron is sort of a caricature. He is a central casting product of the elite. But in the United States, people like me get constructed as elite because I'm a university professor. Yet when I went to college and formed the first germ of an idea to be a university professor, it was because my grandfather, the cotton mill worker, suggested to me that if you go to college and work hard and study hard, you can rise, and this is a good thing. And now, the few remaining cotton mill workers in the United States, if there are any, are Trump supporters, opposed to the elites. And this is going to work out differently in different national cultures. But what is it that's giving rise? As a university professor, I explain to my students that I am a proletarian because I don't own the means of production and have nothing to sell but my labor power. It's well-rewarded labor power, but I don't feel like an elite, yet I'm constructed as an elite because I have 13 years of post-secondary education. So what are your thoughts after you talk about the French situation about this global situation of how elites get constructed by those with grievances?
Well, thank you very much for these fascinating questions. On the second one, I'll start with that one. The elites in France you're an elite if you're, first of all, they are the state elites. As you said, Macron is the epitome of that. And people don't think that these elites represent their interest anymore. So that's why they want, these, popular initiatives, which will not hit at, the deep state, which is run by ENA, the administrative elites. So it's interesting that instead of ENA, this very, very prestigious and selective school, whose graduates really run the country in many ways, instead of that target, they've chosen representative institutions. Because I think they still believe in the welfare state, in the state in general, because in France you have to believe in the state. And because the state is going to save you from globalization, from the European integration, etc. So I think that's the distinction I would make. Now, of course, maybe someone like you and me, would be the elites, yes. Yes, clearly. And that's why I put that up again. It is because obviously they think that if you have, some education, you're different than they are. And now, and people think in France that if you're rich at a very low level, you're rich if you make like 4,000 euros a month. So it's very, very low. Again, it's a very egalitarian society, very egalitarian. And so, of course, the real rich, they are gone. They left the country during Mitterrand and during Hollande, you know, the two socialist presidents. So they are not there anymore. So now their target is only people who make 4,000 a month. Now your first question. So yes, they haven't learned anything, you know, because the
Can you explain what the cahiers are? Well, were?
Le Cahier de Doléances, yes, it was this book.
Doléances as in
Doléances.
O-R-L-A.
The doléances, yes, it's grievance.
Okay.
Grievance books that were filled out, you know, before the French Revolution. And, but of course, the king didn't really, you know, read them, or at least take them into account. So why did Macron go onto that path, which seems to many of you suicidal politically? I think first of all he wanted to show that there would be dialogue. You know, his reputation is that he makes all the decisions. He doesn't listen to too many people, just a very small number of people around him, and he wanted to show that, you know, people would have a say in any, you know, future reforms. But he also made sure, you know, to limit the scope of the Grand Débat. So for example, he said, I will not change the wealth tax, because he scrapped the wealth tax. At least he doesn't take, you know, there is still a wealth tax, but only on real estate, but not on, you know, financial investments, for example. But these people, they ask, you know, for reestablishing the full wealth tax, you know, which is kind of, you know, resentment against the rich. Why, you know, do we have to make all the efforts and the rich, you know, they get away with it? See, they see that, and it's true. They pay more and more, and these rich people, they pay less and less. So Macron made sure that, first of all, that, you know, it was not an completely open debate going into all directions. It has to be consistent with more or less what he still wants to do and might not be able to do anymore. And then he made sure also that what will come in this Cahier de Doléances will not match the Gilets jaunes grievances too closely. So he will, because he doesn't want to give them a bigger echo, and he's going to, we'll see how he does that, but he opened it up way beyond the Gilets jaunes. Actually, the Gilets jaunes, they don't participate in it very much at all, because they think it's fake. So people who participate in it, the banlieue, you know, people who also can blow up any day, you know, the banlieue don't participate. So it's only like, you know, mostly in small towns, etc. So not revolutionary ideas at all. So anyway, that's what I think he's trying to do. Yeah. But he wanted, you know, to show that he was a man of dialogue, and the left especially liked that idea, whereas the right, you know, they like, you know, they want the return to public order. So he's kind of gained from both sides thanks to his idea of the Grand Débat. Yeah. Please. Yeah. You're calling.
Let's see. In addition to the airport being privatized, what else has been privatized, or who wants to privatize government functions, and how is it causal in anything that you've described?
Well, if you're talking about, you know, privatization companies, there are very few that are on the list. Many will never be privatized, and many have already been privatized. But so he has only a couple of companies that he wants to privatize, like the airports. But that's not very many, and some stakes in some utility, etc. So it's not an ambitious program of privatization.
why does he want to privatize the airport? I mean,
The reason they privatized the highway system, huh?
Absolutely.
Why is that?
Well, this is America, you know.
It just smells bad.
Well, it's, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think the freeway, yes, people are very, as you, and the Gilets jaunes especially, they are extremely critical of the, it's not complete privatization. It's not that we gave all the freeways to the private sector. It's a very long-term concession. Concession, is that the term? And so it still belongs to the state. But it seems that the private companies got a pretty good deal, though.
so the usual reason you privatize is that you get to charge tolls, or you get to evade financial controls. And so it's a way of raising money that, that is usually, for instance, if you privatize an airport, somebody pays you, the state, for whatever rights they are getting over the airport. And it's usually a budgetary maneuver that then ends up giving away large amounts of money in the long run to the private company, because the private company would not do this if it did not think it was going to make money out of
Sure.
it, right? Yeah. So it's like privatizing toll roads in the United States. But how could they be so dumb? Or are they just desperate for the money?
No, I don't think that's the latter. I think that you know, the government wanted to alleviate, you know, all of its obligations in terms of, you know, public spending, and they say, well, if we, you know, let the freeways be maintained by private companies, that's so much we won't have to do every year, and you know, it's basically a bankrupt state, you know, because of you know, the debt is about 100% of GDP, which is not the worst. I mean, Belgium is much higher, Italy is much higher. The United States is about
On the way.
yeah, and so it's you know, I think that was the idea, is to alleviate the cost of public spending.
I should say the usual argument on these kinds of things
Yeah.
is that the state isn't really spending enough money, and when you privatize, two things happen. One is the users of that particular public good are now paying. So the users are paying for the benefits they're getting.
Yeah.
And the second thing is you can raise the money for this more easily from the tolls and so on toll roads, and that therefore you will actually get repairs that you would not otherwise get.
No.
That's the usual argument.
Yeah, the freeways are in very good shape.
Outsiders. I mean, the Indiana Toll Road sold its concession for 75 years, but it's mostly out-of-state traffic that drives on the Indiana Toll Road.
Right. Do you still have the question, or did you already ask it?
I've seen the quality of medical care go down visibly in France in the last 25 years.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think they have the economy to take care of their
Right.
people correctly. I see people retire at what seems to me to be an ungodly early age that cripples the productivity of a country. Why is that?
Well, there are two different issues, but the healthcare system, well, my own, and I'm speaking under the authority of a real expert here, so I have to be careful. But I think that the fundamentals of the system are fairly sound, but that they wanted to go the extra way, especially the two socialist governments of Mitterrand and Hollande, although mostly Mitterrand. You know, they mostly, yes, medicine is you pay copay, you know, which is very little. So doctors, general practitioners get paid 25 euros per visit. Can you imagine? That's about, you know, less than $30, and you get reimbursed like 25 out of 30. But people still complain that they have to pay 5 euros. They really do. And then you have to buy a complementary private insurance, usually, not always, but usually mutualist insurance that costs maybe, I mean, more, you know, a few hundred euros per month, I guess. So it's still, you know, very, very cheap. But, you know, these governments, they wanted to, they have a program to scrap, you know, to give you the the mutual, the complementary insurance for free if you don't make a certain amount. And then you have, for example, all illegal immigrants have free healthcare in France. I mean, how many countries do that? You know?
I used to see really good geriatric hospitals in Lyon. They were pearls. They
Not
were
anymore.
destroyed.
Well, there's also the labor, there's been a huge disorganization among like nurses and other employees because of the 35-hour week. And so they cannot recruit more people, and so it's very disorganized. They don't have enough people. Yeah.
I think the geriatric issue is something I should look into more. There are very few countries that had anything resembling the French geriatric hospital system, and and it looks like it has declined some. In general, most of the people who try to study healthcare systems would probably still say that France is one of the better ones. Again, try getting good geriatric care here, as it happens. There's a lot of problems.
Yes, and for many people who have chronic, serious disease, you don't pay anything. My mother had, liver, like cirrhosis, and she had a liver transplant. She didn't pay €1 for it. So this is quite remarkable too. So there are problems also with the number of doctors. There is a quota, stupid, a limit to the number of doctors that can graduate every year. I think Macron is rethinking that, but there aren't enough doctors, and especially in the rural areas. I think it's still a very good system. It's not a bureaucratized, nationalized system like in Canada and Britain, because most doctors are in liberal practice. So there is a single payer that pays you, but most doctors are in liberal practice. So it's very easy to access the system and very cheap. Now, quality might be going down, but your local doctor is likely to be fairly good. No. Hospital is something else, yeah.
I don't have experience with the hospitals, only with the geriatric hospitals that I've seen.
Well, that's a hospital, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next question. Okay, hold on.
Yeah.
Well, Alan first, and then you. Okay.
I wanted to thank you for covering such a range of topics and doing it very seriously, as opposed to many guests who speak for 3 minutes and then field questions rather than having put their thoughts together in anticipation, not in Joe's context, but under others. But we're speaking at a very interesting moment here in time, because there is no resolution. We are in the midst. So there's the question of the future in France, of the Gilets jaunes or of Macron and more broadly. But at no point have you mentioned the possible significance of other European presence, other European countries, their attitudes, their present impact on what's going on in France, and your anticipation with regard to future possible consequences, interactions between the situation in France and the situation in neighboring countries. Should we be concerned? Is this...
Which countries are you concerned with?
Well, anybody who has a frontier in particular, yes.
Yeah.
We could go north, we could go east, we could go... So.
Well, it's true. There are so many, different crises in Europe. North, south about the euro, east, west about democracy in, Hungary and Poland, for example. Immigration with, Italy, Spain, Greece. There are, so many crises, and France, kind of is hit by most of those crises. I think what's very interesting about the Gilets jaunes is that they don't really mention immigration and Islam very much. Those are absolutely center stage in European politics, and especially French politics. And yet, these guys who kind of match to some extent, the Front National profile, they don't talk about it. I mean, so that's I think is interesting. Now, neighboring countries. Obviously, the relationship with Germany is not doing very well. It used to, of course, be much tighter, but there are major disagreements on a number of issues, including the euro and the economy in general. There were disagreements about the refugees, that the Germans let in and the French were more opposed to it under a socialist president. Italy is really a major, I think it's the country that, first of all, it's a country that's very close to France culturally and politically. And so people have been looking at what's going on with these two parties now, governing together in Italy and interfering in French politics. Like Di Maio, who is the head of the Five Star Party, came to France, in the suburb of Paris, and gathered some gilets jaunes and say, yeah, guys, good, go against Macron, etc. And the campaign, European campaign, in Italy by Di Maio and Salvini is very, very anti-French. I mean, there's lots of anti-French rhetoric because their target against is Macron. It is like the guy who in Europe represents, economic and cultural progressivism, if I want to use it like this, but something that they don't share. So basically, you see, the relationship between the two countries being very tense. France recalled its ambassador to Rome because of interference in French politics. And so you see, this is what's happening. In the European election campaign, you can see the lines being drawn. And so Italy, Poland, Hungary, etc., would be very much against Macron because of what he represents. Yeah.
Belgium? What should we be aware of in Belgium in this context?
Belgium. Well, no, I think that it's not critical. I mean, it's important for the Belgium, yeah. But I think that the French look more to Italy, Germany. Spain is, until recently when new elections were called, actually that was the only ally that Macron was expecting to have in the European election, a mild socialist. So yes, the European scene does matter. For Macron, it was very important it was part of his grand design to win these European elections, under that kind of opposition, nationalist versus progressist. But not all pro-Europeans are progressist. So it's I think he's painted himself into a corner here. That the dichotomy, the opposition is not necessarily so simple.
Just quickly, in order to have complicated relationships with a country, that country would sort of have to have a government, wouldn't it? Which is an issue with Belgium. Yes. It's not entirely clear they have a government.
The main concern with Belgium is terrorism, because Belgium, contrary to France, has a very weak, decentralized state. As you know, and with linguistic divisions, etc. So the French consider that the Belgians don't fight against terrorism efficiently, and it's true that there is a very large, mostly Moroccan population in Belgium, mostly from the Rif, which is the northern part of Belgium, which is kind of a lawless area, and so the French are. They have been in the big terrorist attacks over the last few years. There's been lots of connection. There's been a big attack in Brussels. Lots of connections among the terrorist networks between Belgium and France. Yeah.
Thank you. Do you think the people who are like yellow vests, are they really like realistic? Like the reality they are living in France economically? Do you think they're well aware of what's going on in the European Union, in the world. The thing they're targeting, is it really realistic with the economy we have now? Plus, is it related to France being culturally against changes? And French people in general are not, I'm French, so I'm judging like my own people, but so.
Nobody's perfect.
So do you think all those things are like related, or?
Yeah, I mean, certainly France is perceived, especially in this country, as countries that have difficulties to, to go through change. And I think, yes, the Gilets jaunes are saying, this is going too fast. We are losing out. They were ready to make some efforts, like all the leaders were asking them to make some efforts. But since mostly the financial crisis 10 years ago, which they said, well, we are not getting anything through our efforts. We need to change the system. And so I think there is great despair, among the Gilets jaunes. So change, yes, it's true that they don't want too much change. Yeah, that's for sure. No, absolutely.
Can I follow up that quickly?
Yeah.
Do you think the modernizers are realistic? Yeah, I mean, is Macron any more realistic than the Gilets jaunes?
No, because as I said, he should have seen that this path, towards more economic liberalization, more European integration, more immigration, or at least not less immigration, and staying away from the issues, explosive issues of Islam, etc. This is not what people want. So yes, I think in that sense he's irrealistic, but he's also courageous because some reforms need to be done. See, France, it is the paradox. France has been so slow making economic liberal reforms that now it's colliding with a whole new set of issues. And so now it's almost impossible to do it because it was not done before. And so I think that we ended up with both still economic issues, of competitiveness, lack of reform of the state, which is still a fairly bloated state, even though we also have huge issues with immigration and Islam, etc. So we get it all. Yeah.
Any other questions, comments? Professor Tadikoff?
And thank you, Joe. And
No, hold on, please take that.
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Very truly thought-provoking. I could not stop taking notes, and I love to learn. That's what I like to teach.
Thank you.
My students often are my teachers, and you are a great professor. Thank you. My question concerns your labeling, the LREM, La République en Marche. You say it's an artificial party. That's Macron's. I'm just looking at my notes. And you labeled LREM centrist. And later on now, you referred to Macron as progressive. My question is, could you please define or explain the concept of centrist in relation to the concept of progressive?
Okay. Well, let me go back to another slide. This one. Centrist, in the framework of French political institution, centrists don't survive. Mostly because you have the key political fact is the presidential election, and it has a runoff. That means that you have to choose your camp. And Macron, it worked, for the first time. But I don't think it's meant to last, because within LREM, which is a terrible name, within it, you have, it's the center right and the center left that came together, rejecting the mainstream parties on the right and left. But these guys, they don't agree on very many things. I mean, they have to be coerced, to vote together, but more and more on issues of precisely immigration.
Legal immigration.
Well, legal, yes, immigration. and refugees, etc., and Islam, the left, so people from LRM who come from the left, who are often all socialists and sometimes MPs too. These guys, they are for more, multiculturalism, for more immigration, etc. But the right side, not at all. So there are many splits among themselves. They are progressives. So on the cultural issues, which have dominated the political debate until the Gilets jaunes. So the Gilets jaunes, they had disappeared because politicians only paid attention to immigrants and to unions.
Is Macron a statesman? Politicians and statesmen are different. Is Macron a statesman? And we have plenty of politicians everywhere in our democracies.
Is he a statesman?
He's a statesman. According to Plato's definition in his dialogue, the statesman, when Plato tells his student Aristotle, I was wrong, there's no philosopher king, you are right. And he writes the statesman, that dialogue. Is Macron a statesman?
I think Macron is a technocrat who himself, because of the circumstances of his election, he thinks that he heralded a whole new world. He thinks that things will never be like before. And so he could do lots of things that his predecessors didn't do. And actually, he made some reforms that his predecessors were unable to make. But it was kind of an illusion. And now, it caught up with him.
I think in general, if any political leader thinks they're only a statesman, not a politician, they're not going to be there very long. They may have a moment. And Macron shows up at a moment when the standard party system has collapsed. And there's some really weird reasons for that, having to do with corruption and failures within particular parties. And there's some more fundamental reasons for that. And he fills a vacuum. And he's a French technocrat filling a vacuum, which is not that unusual. But if he doesn't know how to be a politician, he's not going to be there more than 5 years, basically, unless he gets really lucky in his opposition.
Because the French were saying before the last presidential elections that it's our last chance. So it's our last chance with Macron. And it was a miracle. Macron got elected. And so France could...
For what?
To basically save the country from the extremes. And it kind of worked with Macron, not with the center-right or center-left, but it worked with someone who was able to present himself as the shield against the far-right. So in that sense, people were saying, well, I don't like this guy so much, I don't like his policies, but I support him because I want France to win and to do well. And so if Macron is not re-elected, I mean, it depends who comes next, but I think that would be, well, it depends who comes next, obviously. But so it's a very big, I mean, this last presidential election was very dramatic. I mean, I'm sure most of you followed it. It was a fascinating election, with the two men, well, Hollande not being able to seek re-election, the favorite on the center-right having a scandal because his wife was paid as an employee of the National Assembly even though she was not working there, etc., etc. So it was an amazing election, and Macron all of a sudden, he popped up and said, oh, at least we have someone who looks clean and smart and young,
This has been the questions have been wonderful. We're running out of time. Let's take one more, and then maybe yes, that's you, and then maybe people can have some chocolate and cookies and so on and coffee, but it is getting to time to close it down. So,
This is meant actually for a short answer. Do you think the situation in France is going to get better before it gets worse, or worse before it gets better?
So it can't just get better, or it can't just get worse.
Well, I don't think so. Well, okay, no, it can't.
I would say it's likely to get worse, but not before it gets better.
Okay.
So that's my short answer.
Yeah, okay. On that happy note, I'm not sure the answer would be any different if we were talking about American politics. You know, 2 years ago, we had Vincent Mochelot from Sciences Po Lyon to come to talk about the election. And perhaps in 2 years, we'll have some other interesting French events to talk about. I'd like to thank you all very much for coming. I'd like to thank Patrick Chamorel for sharing his observations and his wisdom with us. I'd like to thank all of you for sharing your questions and really getting what I think is a very interesting discussion going. So thank you very much, and have a good evening.